a funeral, a wrong hymn, and a secret buried deeper than the casket. Welcome to Grey Whisper. I am your host, Silas Drex. Tell me, where in the world are you solving this mystery from? Your voices bring this channel to life. I can't wait to read your comments. Let's begin. It was a grey Thursday in late October when I returned to Baker Street to find Holmes, already deep in his morning's introspection, seated cross-legged in the armchair with a sheaf of damp newspaper clippings in one hand and a long-stemmed pipe clenched between his teeth. The coal fire hissed with protest as a gust rattled the window pane, and the heavy fog outside had settled like a soiled curtain over the city, muffling the sound of the traffic on Marylebone Road. I had barely hung up my coat when Holmes, without glancing away from the paper, said, "You were delayed at Dr. Anstruther's surgery, Watson, and the boy who handed you that note in the square had clearly been running. His boots were caked in churned gravel." I smiled. "My dear Holmes, you've not lost your touch, but it was a telegram, not a note." "Ah, from Mrs. Armitage, perhaps?" I blinked. "How simple. A rather distinct scent of lilac water clings to your coat sleeve, and only one woman of your acquaintance uses such a specific blend, combined with the fact that her husband passed away last week and you attended the memorial. It is not improbable that she now seeks medical or emotional reassurance." I shook my head in mingled amusement and awe. "You've left me no secrets at all, Holmes. But no, it was not Mrs. Armitage. The telegram was from Inspector Lestrade." That did draw Holmes' gaze. He removed the pipe and leaned forward with interest. "Lestrade, you say? Scotland Yard must be rather desperate to request your presence before 9 o'clock. Or yours, rather. He asked us both to come to St. Hilda's Chapel in Bloomsbury at once. There's been an incident. Odd, he says, though not necessarily criminal. A man collapsed during a funeral, and there's some confusion regarding the identity of the deceased." Holmes rose at once. "A confusion at a funeral. How delicately phrased. Fetch your hat, Watson. We shall take a cab. There's something quite unnatural about misplacing a corpse." St. Hilda's was a narrow Gothic revival chapel wedged between two ancient townhouses, its stone facades soot-darkened and ivy-strangled. We arrived to find the street cordoned off, and a small cluster of mourners, huddled in mourning dress, murmuring with visible distress beneath the overhang of the church gate. Lestrade greeted us at the door with an expression I'd come to recognize as his grudgingly grateful look. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson, sorry to pull you out so early, but the vicar insisted, and frankly, I've never had a funeral interrupted by another death before." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Another death?" Lestrade sighed. "Follow me. The organist collapsed during the service. Dead before he hit the floor, so the attending physician says. Heart failure, possibly. But it's the rest of the scene that's strange." He led us into the chapel where the smell of beeswax and old wood mingled with the faintest trace of tobacco. The air was heavy with incense, and a slight echo still lingered in the arched ceiling. On the left side of the nave, the wooden pews were half filled with well-dressed mourners. At the front, just beside the altar rail, a stretcher had been laid across the stone tiles. Upon it, under a white sheet, lay the organist, his fingers curled stiffly, as if even in death they grasped invisible keys. Holmes studied the body briefly, then turned his attention to the dais. "The deceased for whom this service was intended?" he asked. Lestrade gestured toward a casket at the front of the chapel, half covered in lilies. "A retired bookseller named Mr. Archibald Monk died in his sleep. No controversy about that. But here's the rub. The vicar swears the organist, Mr. Lionel Chappell, began playing the wrong funeral piece. The hymn wasn't from Monk's requested program at all. It was from a different funeral held here last week. And the strangest part? The piece was for a man named Clive Brackett, who was cremated, not buried." Holmes was silent for a moment. "Intriguing. So this is not a case of simple musical error." Lestrade snorted. You'd think not. But who dies mid-hymn, playing the wrong service, unless there's something more to it? Holmes walked slowly toward the organ, a magnificent pipe instrument that filled the chapel's rear alcove like a mechanical altar. He paused beside the foot pedals and stooped. There's something smeared here, Watson. Would you kindly bring that lantern closer? I obliged, and Holmes examined the worn wooden pedal, sniffing lightly. His face changed. Not oil. Something more acrid. Varnish mixed with chloroform, I should say. A thin film of it. Curious. Lestrade looked startled. You think it was foul play? Holmes stood. I think, Inspector, that one does not accidentally spill chloroform on an organ pedal. Nor does one select the wrong funeral music in error, unless there is motive. He turned back to us. Tell me, what do we know of the late Mr. Chapel? Lestrade consulted a small notebook. Long-time employee of the chapel. Bit of a recluse. Lodged nearby with a landlady named Mrs. Horlick. No family that we know of. 42 years old. Clean record. No debts. Well regarded. Holmes nodded absently. And Mr. Monk and Mr. Brackett, were they acquainted? Lestrade shook his head. Far as we can tell, no. Monk was a bachelor and bibliophile. Brackett was a businessman, widowed, died of a carriage accident. The only thing they had in common was that they both used this chapel. Holmes glanced once more toward the organ. Watson, he said quietly, death may come with silence. But here it arrived with a misplayed note. This is no ordinary coincidence. Something has been composed deliberately. Let us see, then, if we can hear the dissonance before the final chord. And with that, we were drawn into a mystery whose melody, I now know, had been rehearsed long before a single key was ever touched. Holmes spent a full 10 minutes studying the organ's mechanics in silence. He crouched, unmindful of the dust that collected on his knees, and peered into the recess behind the keys, running one long finger along the wood beneath the manual. The vicar, a pale, thin man with rimless spectacles and an anxious countenance, hovered nearby, wringing his hands. I cannot understand it, Mr. Holmes, he murmured for the third time. Mr. Chapel was never the type to make a mistake. Never. He had a precise memory for musical order and always kept the program by his side. Indeed, Holmes replied without turning. And did he do so today? Yes, I believe so. I handed him the printed order myself. Holmes stood and walked back to the side lectern. Where is that program now? I don't know. It should be here. The vicar rifled through the stack of hymnals, his voice tightening with each shuffle. No, it's not here. That's strange. Not strange, said Holmes, eyes narrowing. Purposeful. He gestured for Watson to follow and turned toward Lestrade, who was still standing at the rear of the nave, questioning the last of the mourners. Inspector, I require access to Mr. Chapel's lodgings at once. Watson, we shall need to speak with the landlady. Mrs. Horlick, was it? Lestrade frowned, but nodded. Right. I've already posted a constable to keep watch. Address is Winmere Lane, just off Red Lion Street. As we departed the chapel, Holmes paused just outside the entrance and glanced upward. The fog had thickened into a soupy shroud, and the gas lamps lining the street burned weak and gold in the gloom. The mourners had dispersed, but the unsettled air lingered. Holmes drew his coat closer. There is something not quite right about the funeral itself, he muttered. Too quiet. Not in sound, but in structure. Monk's service was meant to be simple, yet the moment was derailed by a single, misplaced piece of music. That tells me it wasn't mere error. I ventured. Do you believe Chapel intended to disrupt it? No, Holmes said. But someone wanted the disruption, and Lionel Chapel was a tool, a precise one, used until he was no longer useful. We found Mrs. Horlick in a narrow terraced house, her spectacles dangling from a chain around her neck and her apron dusted with flour. She seemed more irritated than grief-stricken when told of Mr. Chapel's demise. Well, he was quiet, I'll give him that, she said, leading us up a narrow stairwell. Paid his rent every Monday, took no visitors, and played that blasted harmonium in his room at all hours, like someone was paying him by the scale. Did he ever mention friends, acquaintances, enemies? Holmes asked, glancing over the stair rail. She sniffed. Wouldn't know. He barely spoke 2 words unless you caught him coming in from chapel. We reached the door to chapel's room, number 3 on the upper floor. Mrs. Horlick unlocked it with a brass key and stepped aside. Holmes pushed the door open and entered slowly. The room was Spartan but tidy. A single bed neatly made, a modest writing desk stacked with sheet music, and a harmonium tucked under the window. There were no photographs, no ornaments. A pale blue glass bottle sat beside a basin on the washstand. Holmes approached the desk first. He began sifting through the stack of papers, examining each page with delicate precision. See here, Watson. These are funeral programs, dated in order. I peered over his shoulder. Each program was annotated in Chapel's narrow looping hand. Key changes, alternate harmonizations, tempo notes. The man had been meticulous. Holmes paused at one. Ah, Clive Brackett. He removed it from the pile and held it to the light. Same hymn as this morning. Come, gentle sleep. That is what Chapel played today. It should not have been. He turned the page over. See this watermark? He asked. Parish stock paper, but the ink has begun to blot. Someone added something to this recently. Fresh notation, different pen. He slipped the sheet into his pocket and turned toward the harmonium. Watson, the instrument. I opened it and found it already primed. The bellows creaked slightly as though used recently. Holmes played a single soft chord, then reached beneath the keys. A second compartment, he said. Most harmoniums have a hollow beneath the keyboard. His fingers found a small gap, and he pulled out a folded square of paper. It was stained faintly along the edge and smelled faintly of linseed oil. Holmes opened it slowly. On the page was a crude sketch of a chapel interior. 3 names were written beneath a set of organ pipes. Monk, 26th October, Brackett, 18th October, and Holloway, 2nd November. Watson read the names aloud. Monk and Brackett, and who is Holloway? Holmes looked grim. I suspect we should find out before the week's end. This may be a timetable of funerals. Lestrade, who had just entered the room, heard the name and pulled a small pocketbook from his coat. Holloway, Gerald Holloway. Yes, I recall that one. Retired military man. Widow placed a service notice 2 weeks ago. Funeral scheduled this coming Sunday. At St. Hilda's. There, Holmes said sharply. 3 funerals, 1 per week. Same chapel, same organist, same hymn. Lestrade's brow furrowed. You think someone's targeting mourners? Holmes shook his head. Not mourners, not directly. Someone is using the chapel's funerals to conceal another agenda. Brackett's service ended with cremation, Monk's burial. But in both cases, the hymn was identical. 2 identical. A signal, perhaps. And if Chapel played that hymn today and then died moments later, he was silenced, I said. Precisely, Holmes murmured. But not soon enough. That sketch he left behind, it was no musical note. It was a warning. Lestrade's eyes widened. You think he knew? I think he realized too late. Perhaps only this morning when the program was switched, when he saw the name Brackett again. And I suspect he intended to sound an alarm with the only medium he had. Music. Holmes folded the sketch and turned to Lestrade. We must speak to the widow of Clive Brackett, find out who attended his funeral. Someone among them may be our ghost in the chapel. Lestrade nodded, already reaching for his coat. I'll arrange it. She lives in Hampstead. As we turned to go, Holmes paused at the threshold. He glanced once more around the room, then back at the sheet music, the quiet harmonium, the perfectly arranged bed. Everything in order, he murmured. And yet someone wanted him erased. Outside, the fog had thinned slightly, but the city still held its breath. As our cab pulled away from Windmere Lane, I caught Holmes staring not at the streets, but at the folded paper in his hand. "A signal," he said again, more to himself than to me. "Music meant for the dead, but heard only by the living. Let us hope, Watson, that Mr. Holloway does not become the final note in this grim sonata." Our cab rattled through the autumn-choked streets of Bloomsbury, past shop-fronts dimmed by soot and row-houses slumped under the weight of fog. Holmes was unusually quiet. He sat with his arms folded, and his gaze fixed on the blur of gaslights through the window, though I could see his mind racing behind the stillness. I had seen that particular silence before. It was the hush that came when he had not yet grasped the shape of the problem, but could feel it just beyond the veil. "We are being permitted to see just enough," he murmured at last, "that we remain confused." "Then someone wants this to appear logical," I said. "But only just so?" Holmes nodded faintly. 3 funerals, 3 names, the same chapel, same organist, but no clear link between the deceased. The choice of him may be the only pattern, and it is a pattern devised not for the mourners nor the vicar, but for one particular listener. Mr. Chapel? Perhaps. Or perhaps Mr. Chapel was only one stop on the signal's route. We arrived in Hampstead shortly after noon. The Brackett residence stood on a slope above the heath, a handsome brick townhouse with shuttered windows and an iron gate half swallowed by ivy. A maid admitted us without much ceremony, leading us to a drawing-room hung with heavy portraits and velvet curtains. The atmosphere inside was stiff, almost theatrical, and every surface glistened with polish. The widow, Mrs. Eleanor Brackett, entered moments later. She was tall, thin, and dressed in mourning, but the black fabric could not conceal the fact that she was considerably younger than her late husband. I judged her no older than 30. Her eyes were pale and appraising, and though she expressed polite grief, there was a curious detachment in her voice, as though the event had happened to someone far away. "Inspector Lestrade wrote that you were coming," she said, offering a limp hand to Holmes. He mentioned it was something about the service. "It is," Holmes replied, "though not Mr. Brackett's death per se, but what occurred during it and after. You see, Mrs. Brackett, you are now the second person associated with that particular hymn to have lost someone, and we are concerned there may soon be a third." She did not flinch. Instead, she studied Holmes a moment and said, "You believe Clive was murdered?" Holmes arched an eyebrow. "He died in what appeared to be a carriage accident. His driver perished as well, I believe." "Yes," she said. "Mr. Kershaw? Broken neck. It was raining. The horses slipped. At least that's what the coroner ruled. There was nothing suspicious in the report. Nonetheless, I would be grateful if you could tell us who was in attendance at his funeral. Were there any guests who stood out? Unusual reactions? Interjections during the service?" She sat carefully on the edge of the sofa and folded her hands. It was not a large affair. My husband disliked pomp. There were some business associates, mostly from the shipping firm, Mr. Halliwell, Mr. Keene, a few relatives from Devon, my cousin, Charlotte Thwaite, and her husband, the vicar, of course. "And the organist?" "Yes," she said. "I remember him. Very pale. Played beautifully. Not a note out of place." "Did anyone speak with him?" Holmes asked. "Did you?" She hesitated. "Number Y assumed he was a church employee. He left quickly after the service." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, if you please, the guest book." I retrieved it from my satchel. Lestrade had collected it from the chapel earlier that morning, along with the parish's list of scheduled services. Holmes flipped through the pages until he found the entry for the Brackett funeral. He scanned the signatures, paused on one and tapped it with his finger. "Miss Charlotte Thwaite." He rose and addressed Mrs. Brackett. "Would it be possible to speak with your cousin?" She blinked. "Charlotte? She's visiting her father in Oxfordshire for the week. She'll be back Sunday." Holmes frowned. Sunday, the day of Holloway's funeral. He closed the book. Thank you, madam. One final question, if you don't mind. Did your husband mention anyone? Any new contact, unfamiliar correspondence, strange visitors in the weeks before his death? No, she said. He was under pressure at work, I suppose. But Clive kept his business and his home separate. We rarely discussed such matters. We took our leave shortly after. Holmes was quiet again as we walked to the carriage, but his fingers tapped a restless beat on the brim of his hat. Her manner is curious, he said as we climbed in. Too calm. Either she is remarkably well composed, or there is something she is withholding. She didn't seem surprised when you suggested her husband may have been murdered. Indeed, nor did she ask for proof. Most widows would, unless, of course, she had entertained the thought herself. I glanced back at the house. Do you think she's involved? I think she is cautious. That is not yet a crime. But let us not forget, Brackett was a shipping man. Those who deal in overseas ventures often carry with them debts, secrets, or cargo that goes unlisted. We may yet find our connection there. Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread the three names, Monk, Brackett, Holloway, on the floor of the sitting room, each on a separate card, and beneath each name he began listing traits. Brackett, business, transport, accidental death. Monk, bookseller, died in bed, no family. Holloway, retired officer, military past, no evident overlap. I poured us both tea. What of the dates? Regular intervals, Holmes said. A week apart, each on a Sunday, each funeral booked at St. Hilda's, each with the same organist, but not the same congregation. Unless, I ventured, there was someone attending all three. He turned to me. Precisely. He rose suddenly and reached for his coat. Come, Watson. There is one man who may give us more than the vicar, the widow, or the chapel records. Mr. Miles Whitby, assistant caretaker at St. Hilda's. He sees everything, funerals, rehearsals, organ tunings, visitors, and more importantly, he sees who returns when no one else is watching. We found Mr. Whitby in the chapel's boiler room that afternoon, feeding coal into the iron furnace. He was a round-faced man in his 50s with a voice like gravel soaked in tea. Yes, I remember the funerals, he said, leaning on his shovel. Brackett's was quiet, Monk's even quieter. Don't think I saw more than a dozen mourners combined. Holmes stood with his back to the boiler's orange glow. But did you notice anyone who attended more than one? Whitby scratched his chin. Maybe. Hard to be sure. Wait, yes. There was a man with a beard. Stood in the back row both times. Didn't wear mourning either time. Had gloves, though. Did he speak to anyone? To Mr. Chappell? Not that I saw, but he stayed after the monk service. Sat by the organ bench. Just sat. Thought he was grieving, maybe. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Could you describe him? Tall, stooped a little. Grey beard, but not full. Brown coat with leather trim. Looked like a professor. Didn't sign the book either time. Holmes was already at the door. Thank you, Mr. Whitby. You've been most helpful. Outside in the gathering dusk, Holmes turned to me, eyes bright. We have our phantom, the one listener for whom the hymn was meant. He sat through both funerals and perhaps would have returned for the third. You believe he arranged all this? I believe he has a message, and has used death as the postage. He stopped suddenly, his voice lowering. And if Lionel Chappell recognized him after the second service, then his death this morning was no misstep. He looked at the fog settling over the street, at the bell tower high above. We must catch this man, Watson, before Sunday's funeral becomes his next address. The next morning, Holmes rose earlier than usual. I found him in the sitting room before the fire, not lounging as he often did, but pacing in slow, measured lines across the rug. The cards with the names, Monk, Brackett, Holloway, still lay arranged on the floor, but Holmes had now added a fourth, a blank one, upon which he had scrawled in bold, ink-black strokes. The listener. He did not look up when I entered, "We are missing the fulcrum, Watson," he said. "The pivot on which all three of these names spin." "The man with the beard," I offered. Holmes gave a short nod. "He attended 2 funerals. He sat at the back. He left no name. He may well have been seen by Chapel, and now Chapel is dead. But who is he? What does he seek?" I poured the tea, still warm in the pot from Mrs. Hudson's early kindness. "You said yesterday that this man might be the audience for the hymn." Holmes took the cup without breaking stride. "Yes, which suggests that the message is not in the hymn itself, but in when it is played, and who hears it. You think the hymn is a signal? Perhaps a summons, or a warning. The question is whether it was meant to be understood by Chapel, or by this unknown figure in the back pew, or both." There was a knock at the door, and before Mrs. Hudson could call up, Lestrade let himself in. He was out of breath and looked as though he'd walked the whole of Whitehall to get here. "I've come straight from the yard," he said, dropping his hat on the table. "You were right, Holmes. Brackett's firm, Gloucester Maritime Trading, was under investigation. One of the directors turned Queen's evidence last month. The Home Office buried the inquiry to avoid panic on the exchange, but the charge involved illegal arms smuggling. Rifles moved through civilian cargo. Brackett had been warned, quietly, to cooperate." "Did he?" Holmes asked. "Too early to tell. But 3 days before his death, he received a visitor, a Mr. Jasper Keene, one of the junior partners, the same man who was present at his funeral." Holmes gave a short whistle. "Keene? The same man Mrs. Brackett mentioned." Alongside Mr. Halliwell, Lestrade leaned in. "And Keene has gone missing." Holmes froze. "Since when?" "He didn't return home yesterday. His landlord says he left before dawn, bags packed. No notice, no message." Holmes stepped to the mantel and placed a finger to his temple. "Keene is the connection," he said, "between the shipping scandal and the listener at the funeral. Brackett may have known too much or too little. Either way, someone decided to end the conversation. And now Mr. Keene, perhaps fearing the same fate, has fled." Watson asked quietly, "Do you think Keene was the one with the beard?" "Unlikely," Holmes replied. "Whitby described a man older than Keene. Keene is in his 30s, is he not?" Lestrade confirmed it. 35, clean-shaven, brown hair. Nothing like Whitby's man. Holmes resumed pacing. "Then we are still left with 2 unknowns, our listener, and now the hand that guides him, or perhaps restrains him." He paused and then said, "We must find Charlotte Thwaite, Mrs. Brackett's cousin. She may prove less reserved than her relative, and she, too, attended Brackett's funeral. If this listener stood out to Whitby, perhaps he stood out to her as well." Lestrade promised to send a man to the Oxfordshire address, but Holmes was already pulling on his gloves. "We haven't time for couriers," he said. "Watson, the train leaves from Paddington in 40 minutes. If we're lucky, we shall arrive by mid-afternoon." By 2 o'clock, we were standing on the front step of a modest stone cottage at the edge of a quiet country village. Charlotte Thwaite, when she answered, appeared more surprised than alarmed. She was a plain woman of about 28, quick-eyed and candid in her speech. Upon hearing the reason for our visit, she led us into a parlor that smelled of apples and old lace. "That funeral," she said, frowning. "It was strange. Eleanor barely cried. But I remember someone else, yes, a man I didn't recognize. He came alone, didn't speak to anyone, and didn't look like he belonged." "Describe him, if you would," Holmes asked. She did so with care, and her details matched Whitby's. The beard, the brown coat with leather trim, the habit of sitting in the last pew. Then something new. "He had a book," she said. "A small one, worn. He kept glancing into it during the service." "A prayer book?" I asked. "No," she said. "It was smaller, pocket-sized, dark green. I caught a glimpse of it when he leaned forward. No title on the spine." Holmes sat forward. "Did he do anything unusual during the hymn?" she thought. Yes, now that you mention it. When the hymn began, the second one, not the first, he pressed something between the pages. A slip of paper, maybe. Then he left before the vicar gave the final benediction. Holmes's expression turned razor-sharp. You are certain? Quite. I watched him. Something about him made me uncomfortable. Holmes stood. Miss Thwaite, you've been exceedingly helpful. If you should see that man again, I urge you, send word to me at Baker Street, no matter the hour. She nodded, pale now, but composed. As we boarded the train back to London, Holmes leaned against the cabin wall and closed his eyes. A code, he said softly. Notes passed in plain view, under cover of solemnity. Chapel services as dead drops. A hymn, a page, a rendezvous. Some mechanism we have not yet uncovered. But it is orchestral, Watson. Every player has a role. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the gas lamps had been lit and the city lay under a dull amber glow. Mrs. Hudson handed Holmes a slip of paper as we came in. This came for you while you were out, she said. No messenger waited. Holmes unfolded the note. It was unsigned, written in a rough, slanted hand. He watched both funerals. He will return for the third. But not to grieve. Holmes read it twice. Then he passed it to me without comment and turned to Lestrade, who had arrived only minutes earlier, with updates from the yard. We must have full security in place at St. Hilda's for the Holloway funeral, Holmes said. Plainclothes officers, half inside, half out, and I want eyes on the chapel from tonight onward. Lestrade frowned. You expect the man to return? He must, Holmes said. The hymn is his signal. If the pattern holds, he will not resist hearing it again. Lestrade looked unconvinced. What then? Arrest him during the service? Holmes shook his head. Number, we watch, we wait, and we follow. This man is not a killer in the ordinary sense. He is a courier, or worse, a witness. But someone else, someone behind him, is orchestrating the deaths. He tapped the fireplace mantel, his voice dropping. Chapel's fingers were stained with varnish and chloroform, but he did not apply them himself. He was made to play that hymn, and then silenced. He turned to me. Watson, tomorrow you and I shall go to St. Hilda's early. I wish to examine the organ more closely. I have a suspicion about the keys. And Holloway? I asked. Holmes looked toward the window, where fog licked the panes like breath on cold glass. If we do not unravel this soon, he said, Mr. Holloway's funeral will not be a final movement, but merely another verse. The following morning broke grey and brittle, the kind of morning London wears like a funeral veil. Holmes and I arrived at St. Hilda's well before the bell tolled 8. The city had not yet fully stirred, and the chapel lay in a hush so deep it felt suspended between worlds. A constable posted at the gate saluted us, and Holmes returned the gesture with the barest inclination of his head. Inside, the chapel was empty, but for the lingering scent of wax and cold incense. The coffin for Colonel Gerald Holloway had not yet arrived, though the pews were already polished and dressed for solemnity. The morning light fell in slanted bands through the stained glass, slicing the shadows in colored silence. Holmes made for the organ at once. He climbed the narrow steps to the loft, where the great instrument sat like a waiting beast. I followed behind, noting how the air grew colder in that alcove, as though music, once summoned, had never entirely left. Observe, Holmes said softly, gesturing toward the upper keyboard. Mr. Chapel would have used this manual for the softer preludes. Look here. He pointed to 3 keys, A, C sharp, and E, that bore faint scratches along the edges. Worn differently than the others, I observed. Yes, Holmes said, because they were not merely played. They were pressed with force and frequency beyond what the music demanded. He bent low, examining the gap between the keys, then produced a small, flat instrument from his coat, more surgical than musical, and worked it gently beneath the A key. With a faint pop, the key tilted upward. Holmes reached into the gap with tweezers and drew out a tiny folded rectangle of paper, no larger than a postage stamp. His face remained still, but I heard the intake of breath behind his teeth. Unfolding the slip, he held it to the light. On it were 3 words, printed in black ink. "Not yet safe." He passed it to me. The letters were firm, deliberate, without haste. "A warning," I said. "Or an answer?" "Perhaps both," Holmes murmured. The key had been used before, pressed repeatedly to deliver messages like this. I suspect others were passed in precisely the same way. And if the wrong person had pressed the key, it would have meant nothing. The message was waiting for the intended reader, and if our listener knew which keys bore these messages, then he came not for mourning, but for correspondence. I studied the chapel again, seeing it now not as a place of rest, but as a stage. The organist's bench was no longer merely a seat. It was a signal station, the hymns mere alibis, and the music a code passed beneath the nose of every clergyman in London. Holmes replaced the key and carefully sealed the board. He turned to me. "We must find a way to isolate our listener during today's funeral. Not confront him yet, but follow. The funeral begins at noon. Between now and then, we must ensure our men are placed where they can observe without disturbing the sanctity of the ceremony." Lestrade arrived shortly thereafter, clad in plain black and carrying a short list of men he had brought from the yard, each discreet, each instructed not to interfere unless signaled. Holmes approved their placement swiftly. 1 man in the first pew, another by the south door, 2 at the rear corners, and 1 in the choir loft opposite the organ. "We are not catching a thief today," Holmes said. "We are catching a shadow. He will not run. He will withdraw, quietly, but if he receives another message, and I believe he will, we shall follow him to the hand that writes them." By 11:45, mourners began to arrive. Most were elderly military men, upright and formal in their mourning coats, their medals tucked beneath sombre lapels. Holloway had been well regarded, it seemed, though not intimately known. His widow, a small weeping woman in veiled black, sat with her niece and a solicitor. Then, as the clock above the altar struck the hour, Holmes nudged my elbow. "Back row. Left aisle." I looked. A tall figure had entered alone, moving with quiet deliberation. Grey beard, brown coat with leather trim, gloves. He chose the last pew and seated himself as if settling into a recurring dream. His gaze went not to the casket nor the widow, but to the organ loft above, where a young replacement organist, fresh from the Royal Academy and unaware of any darker scheme, prepared his music. Holmes leaned back, his posture loose, eyes half-lidded. "Watch his hands, Watson," he murmured. "Not his eyes. A man can hide his thoughts in his face, but not in his fingers." The service began with a reading, then a solemn prayer. The organist struck the first chords of the hymn. "Come, gentle sleep." At the second stanza, the listener moved, not his whole body, only his right hand. It slipped into his coat pocket. Briefly, then withdrew. Something now rested on the hymnal in his lap. A green book, small, worn. My heart quickened. Holmes did not move. The hymn ended. The vicar spoke briefly of duty and rest. The congregation stood for the committal. The listener did not. Instead, he bowed his head, still and unmoving. Then, with practiced discretion, he slid the book forward on the pew. When he stood, it was gone from his hand. Holmes was already rising. Lestrade, 3 pews away, caught the movement and nodded once. The listener exited slowly, without haste, as if bearing a quiet grief. But 2 yard men had already slipped out ahead of him. Holmes touched my sleeve. "Wait precisely 20 seconds, he whispered. "Then follow." I did as instructed. When I stepped out into the narrow street behind the chapel, I saw the listener turning the corner toward Southampton Row, the tails of his coat stirring behind him. He did not look back. Holmes, now in a different hat and scarf, followed at a careful distance. We trailed the man for nearly 20 minutes, through alleys, past cafes, across 2 thoroughfares. He paused once at a tobacconist's window, then moved on. He was not wandering. He was leading, or perhaps being led. At last, he stopped before a bookshop. Its sign read J. Halliwell and Company, Antiquarian and Foreign Volumes. Holmes slowed, then drew alongside me as the man entered the shop. "You see?" he whispered. "The name we've heard once before. Mr. Halliwell, associate of Brackett, present at the funeral. Mentioned by the widow." "And now a meeting point," I said. Holmes nodded. "We do not enter yet. Let him speak. We shall. Watch." We waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Another figure arrived, a man in a dark cloak, face obscured. He entered without knocking. Holmes grew taut. Then the door opened again. The listener stepped out, but not alone. He now walked with a package under his arm, a box carefully tied. He passed us without recognition. Holmes's eyes followed him, and for a moment he seemed torn between shadows. "Let him go," he said at last. "We have the name. Halliwell. The listener is a courier, but Halliwell may be the composer." As we turned back toward Baker Street, the bells of St. Hilda's rang softly behind us. Another funeral complete. Another message passed. But now, at last, we had begun to hear the music. The fog was rolling back in by the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. It crept low along the cobbles like a cat stalking across a dim hallway, and even the horses in the street seemed unnerved by its weight. Holmes wasted no time once we were inside. He removed his coat with mechanical precision, lit the fire to dispel the damp, and went immediately to the desk where the cards bearing the names Monk, Brackett, Holloway still lay. He now added a fourth, Halliwell. He stood before the fireplace, hands behind his back, eyes fixed on the newest edition. I did not disturb him. The room was silent save for the slow crackle of burning coal and the rhythmic tapping of Holmes's foot on the parquet floor. "I've seen Halliwell before," he said at last, "but only once, and never in person. A report passed across Mycroft's desk. 2 years ago, shipping and brokerage, an agent for foreign publishing houses. Perfectly legal on the surface, but always with shadowed margins. His name came up in the matter of contraband literary circulation, banned manuscripts exchanged under the guise of rare books. Nothing could be proven. He turned sharply to me. "But Watson, this is no longer about books." "No," I said. "It's about information." Holmes gave a brief nod. "And now we must ask, what information was passed within that chapel? What secrets are important enough to be disguised as sacred music, relayed through funerals, and protected at the cost of an organist's life?" A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a note, folded and sealed. "No messenger," she said. "Just this, left at the doorstep." Holmes broke the seal. He read it once, then twice, then passed it silently to me. "There will be no next hymn. The choir has seen enough, but he will not stop. He is preparing the final movement." I looked up. "It's him, the listener?" Holmes's face was unreadable. "It is someone else. Someone who watches him, or perhaps speaks through him. The phrasing, final movement, is theatrical, not a courier's term. It suggests composition. It suggests planning." His gaze returned to the fire. "He will not stop. And yet, no next hymn? That means no fourth. Funeral. He believes the pattern has been broken." I stepped to the mantel. "Then our chance may be closing." "Or beginning," Holmes said. "Because if he no longer needs the chapel, then he is near the end of his design. He turned to me abruptly. We must revisit Halliwell's shop. Not as observers this time, but as intruders. I blinked. Now? This evening, after dark. The listener received a package, yes. But it was not meant to be opened. It was meant to be delivered. And while he plays the part of messenger, Halliwell plays the part of archivist. You believe he's storing something? More than that. I believe the entire shop is a facade. If I'm right, then beneath those shelves, hidden in the very walls, are the documents, messages, perhaps even the original ledgers that link this scheme together. The funerals were merely a means of transit. He moved to the table, opened a drawer, and withdrew a slim roll of tools, a dark overcoat, and 2 pairs of soft-soled shoes. We go as shadows, Watson. For this, the yard is too blunt an instrument, and the fog will favor us. By 8:30, we stood in the alley behind Halliwell and Company, the street deserted save for the flicker of a distant lamplight. Holmes produced a thin tool and went to work on the side entrance, his breath steady in the cold air. Within seconds, the lock gave way with a subtle click. We slipped inside. The interior smelled of old paper, dust, and something faintly chemical. The shop was dark, but the moonlight seeping through the front display cast dim patterns across the rows of shelves. We moved soundlessly, past spines and tomes and stacks of unlabeled crates. Holmes paused before a shelf near the rear. An unusually deep one. He ran his hand along the top, then stopped. "There," he whispered. "Feel." I stepped close. The wood was warmer than the surrounding air. "A false panel," he said, "with a heat source behind it. A lamp, perhaps. Something's active." He produced a thin blade and worked it along the edge. The panel gave way on quiet hinges. Behind it was a narrow cavity, barely large enough for a man to slip through and filled with rows of shallow drawers. Holmes pulled one open. It contained sheet music, but not for any public hymnal. Each page bore the stamp of the Royal Conservatory, but had been altered by hand. Annotations ran up the margins in tight ciphered notation. "A code," Holmes whispered. "Written into musical instruction." He drew out 3 more drawers, each filled similarly. Some were addressed to initials, M. K. CT. Others were unsigned. Then his hand paused on a sealed envelope, tucked beneath a final manuscript. He broke it open. Inside was a list of names. Brackett, Chapel, Holloway. And beneath them, one more. Dr. John Watson. I stared at it, stunned. "What?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. He examined the paper closely, then turned it toward the light. This was not part of the same transmission. Look, different hand, different ink. Added recently. "But why me?" Holmes's voice was low. "Because someone knew you were watching, that you were part of the disruption. The listener was being observed. But so were you." Footsteps echoed outside the alley. Holmes closed the drawer instantly, reset the panel, and motioned sharply. We ducked into the rear storeroom just as a key scraped into the side lock. From our hidden vantage, we saw the door open. A figure entered, hooded, quick, and alone. Not Halliwell, the listener. He moved without hesitation to the rear shelf, paused, and then, strangely, knelt as if in prayer. His hands rested against the wall and he bowed his head. Holmes's mouth moved silently. He's not retrieving. Indeed, the man remained there, motionless. Then, after nearly a minute, he rose and turned. But he looked not to the door. He looked straight at our hiding place. Holmes pulled me backward, out of the sight line, just as the figure crossed the room. But no door opened. No lock turned. Silence. And when we emerged, 30 seconds later, the shop was empty. Gone. Not a sound. Only the sealed wall behind the shelf, and a faint trail of moisture on the floor as if a fog had passed through the shop itself. Holmes stared at the spot where the figure had knelt. "We are no longer the hunters, Watson," he said slowly. He has seen us, and now we must move faster than he expects. We left the shop, locking it behind us. Holmes said nothing more until we were half a block away, then turned sharply. "There is a fourth name," he said. "A fourth body we have not yet accounted for." I froze. "Who?" Holmes's eyes held a rare glint of dread. "Jasper Keene." The streets felt narrower as we walked, the night pressing in with the density of damp wool. Neither Holmes nor I spoke for several minutes after he uttered Keene's name. The silence between us wasn't empty. It bristled with the shape of something unspoken, something Holmes had begun to see but had not yet shown me. Finally, he stopped at a dim corner where a single gas lamp sputtered like a dying star. He removed his gloves and pressed his fingers against the iron post as though the cold helped him think. "Watson," he said quietly. "Keene fled before Chappell's death. His name appeared at the margins of this case, mentioned by Brackett's widow, seen at the funeral, then vanished. I believed him a coward, a minor player afraid of exposure. But I was wrong." He turned to face me, the flickering light catching only half his expression. He wasn't running from guilt. He was running from the end. "You think he knew he was next?" "I believe he received a message, just as Chappell did. Only Keene understood it." I thought of the tiny note beneath the organ key. "Not yet safe." "What kind of message?" I asked. "Another musical signal?" Holmes shook his head. "Something more direct. I suspect Halliwell delivered it personally, perhaps even under the guise of assistance. Keene, once confronted, likely offered something in exchange: information, names, or silence. But if he became a liability..." Holmes didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. We returned to Baker Street to find Lestrade waiting, shoulders hunched and eyes rimmed with fatigue. He stood as we entered and handed Holmes a report. "Keene's body's been found," he said without preamble. "Or what's left of it. Dockside warehouse, south of Limehouse. We got a tip, anonymous, of course. No ID, but the landlord confirmed him by a ring on the left hand. Registered under an alias, John Curley. He'd been there less than a week." Holmes read the report with a stillness so complete it seemed he'd left the room entirely. He folded the paper slowly. "Cause of death?" Lestrade hesitated. "Hard to say. Blunt force trauma, perhaps. But there were signs of restraint and, well, you'd best see for yourself." Holmes didn't need prompting. We departed again without delay, the three of us riding silently in a yard carriage through the ragged veins of East London. Limehouse by night was a place of shifting shapes and suspicious windows, where river mist clung to the skin like oil and the air smelled of coal smoke and distant rot. The warehouse sat squat and low against the bank, flanked by rusted cranes and heaps of discarded rope. Inside, a constable led us to the body. It lay on a canvas sheet beneath a broken window, the surrounding boards stain dark. Keene had not died easily. Holmes knelt beside the corpse. He examined the wrists, the collar, the soles of the boots. "There's salt under his nails," he murmured, "and residue of rope burn on the left ankle. He was bound, but only one leg." Odd Lestrade crouched beside him. "You think he escaped?" "No," Holmes said. "He was permitted movement, partial restraint. Perhaps a warning, perhaps a gesture of control. And look here, behind the ear, a needle mark." "Drugs?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Likely a sedative, not to kill him, to dull him." He stood abruptly. Someone wanted Keene silent, but not right away. They wanted something from him first. Lestrade gestured to the surroundings. Nothing else here but a torn scrap of paper under the cot. Looked like music paper. I had it sent to the yard. Holmes's eyes darkened. He had no instrument, no books, and yet music finds him even here. He turned away from the body, then paused, as though hearing something none of us could. "Keene was never part of the design," he said. He was its audience. He tried to flee once he heard the last verse. We returned to the yard just before 3 in the morning. Lestrade had the scrap waiting. It was torn from a larger score, familiar manuscript paper with a 4-measure line scrawled in a hand we now recognized. It ended on a half cadence, a musical phrase that hung in the air without resolution. Holmes stared at it for a long time. "It's not music," he said at last. "It's an instruction, or perhaps a threat." He paced the length of the office, then returned to the desk. "There's one name still unspoken," he said. "We've circled it, heard it whispered from the edge. But we have not seen him." Lestrade frowned. "Who?" "Colonel Holloway." I blinked. "But he's dead." "Precisely. Or so we've been told." Holmes turned to us both. And yet, no medical certificate was filed with the city. No physician of record. The funeral was arranged not by his widow, but by a solicitor. The body was delivered in a sealed casket by private transport, and there was no viewing. Lestrade straightened. "You think he faked his death?" "I think he composed it." We were silent. Then Holmes said more softly. Chapel was silenced. Bracket removed. Monk and anchor to history, perhaps. But Holloway is the architect. Lestrade moved to the door. "I'll send for a court order. We can have the grave opened by morning." Holmes shook his head. "It will be empty, or filled with a body not his. We need not disturb the ground to prove it. We need to speak to the widow again, and this time ask her who she is." The night was beginning to lift as we reached Holloway's townhouse in Kensington. The gas lamps still burned, but the sky had taken on a bruised grey pallor. We knocked twice before the door opened, not to a servant, but to the same slight, black-veiled woman we had seen at the funeral. Her face registered no surprise. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "you're early." Holmes inclined his head. "You were expecting us?" "No," she said, "but I knew it couldn't be long." She stepped aside. The house was dimly lit, unnaturally still. Holmes stepped inside first, eyes scanning every corner. Then he turned to the woman. "You are not the Colonel's widow," he said flatly. She didn't deny it. "No. Your real name?" "Lena Wess. I worked with the Colonel during the Cyprus Intelligence Initiative." I owed him a debt. "And you've been playing a part ever since?" She smiled faintly. Holloway always had a plan. Even for death. The funeral was his curtain call. Holmes took a slow breath. "Where is he?" She shook her head. "Gone. Disappeared a week before the service. Left me the instructions, the ring, the certificate. Everything I needed to convince the world he had died." Lestrade's voice was sharp. "You realize you're aiding a fugitive." "He is no criminal," she said. "He is a patriot, the last of his kind. He said there was something coming, something larger than betrayal, deeper than treason. He needed to vanish before it reached him." Holmes's voice was nearly a whisper. "And the funerals?" "He said they were signals, rehearsals, a way to communicate with those who would understand. He said the final message would be delivered only if the others failed." I stepped forward. "What message?" She looked at me then, truly looked, and I saw, just for a moment, that she didn't fully know, but she answered anyway. "A requiem." Holmes stood absolutely still. Then, slowly, he turned to us both. "We must return to St. Hilda's," he said. "Now, before it begins." Dawn had scarcely broken when our cab tore back through the empty streets toward St. Hilda's. The driver, roused from his morning pipe and half-buttoned coat, cursed softly as Holmes urged him on with the kind of urgency he rarely showed in public. Beside me, Holmes sat in stillness, though every muscle in his frame radiated tension. I could see the calculation behind his gaze, the movement of deduction building to some conclusion still just out of reach. Behind us, Lestrade kept checking the cylinder of his revolver. "You believe there's danger at the chapel?" he asked. "Now, this morning." Holmes didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low and controlled. Colonel Holloway was a strategist, a military man turned intelligence broker. He faked his death not simply to disappear, but to orchestrate something intended to unfold after his departure. The funerals were rehearsals, as Miss West called them. And what follows a rehearsal, gentlemen? "A performance," I said. Holmes nodded once. "Precisely. The final movement, as the listener's note put it. We assumed it was a metaphor. I no longer believe that." Lestrade leaned forward. "You think something will happen at the chapel?" "I think something will happen through it. The chapel is the mouthpiece, and we must silence it before it sings." St. Hilda's loomed in the mist like a silhouette drawn in soot. The iron gate stood slightly ajar, and no parishioners stirred in the yard, unsurprising as no service was scheduled. Holmes moved quickly, ignoring the main entrance and circling instead to the side door we had seen the listener use before. It was locked, but he made short work of it, and within moments we were inside the dim hush of the nave. The interior was colder than before, the kind of chill that came not from lack of heat, but from something long left alone. The pews stretched out in shadow, each one familiar now, like actors waiting in place for their final cue. Holmes walked directly to the organ, but this time he did not ascend to the loft. Instead, he walked to the front of the instrument and pressed his fingers to the floor just beneath the lowest pedal board. Then he knocked. A hollow echo replied. "Watson, help me," he said. "Lestrade, be ready." We dragged the carpet aside and found, concealed by a ring of false slats, a trapdoor. Its hinges were freshly oiled. Holmes lifted it, revealing a short stair descending into darkness. No scent of earth, no smell of damp stone, only dry, stale air, thin and quiet. We descended. The chamber below was narrow and bricked in old mortar, just wide enough for a man to walk single file. Shelves lined the walls, each filled not with coffins, as I feared, but with carefully catalogued packages, folders, scores, ledgers, sealed boxes of correspondence, dozens, perhaps hundreds. A hidden archive. "Good God," Lestrade whispered. Holmes moved with purpose, his lantern sweeping over the spines of worn ledgers until he found what he sought. A black case, tucked into the lowest shelf, marked not with a name, but with a single date. Today's. He opened it. Inside was a reel of wax recording cylinder, a small envelope, and a folded map of London marked with precise red X's across 6 buildings, 3 government offices, 1 telegraph exchange, and 2 railway hubs. Holmes opened the envelope. Inside was a note, again in that narrow, slanted hand. "The funeral ends at noon. The music plays. The city listens. They will not hear silence." I stepped backward, heart rising. "A coded broadcast," Holmes said flatly. "Through the organ. Holloway built a mechanical relay inside it, disguised in the pipes. The notes, once struck, activate a signal that passes wirelessly through the recording cylinder. The chapel becomes the sender." Lestrade stared at the map. "And the red marks? Target receivers?" Holmes nodded. "Yes. Strategic communication points. Once the organ plays the recording, the sound, encoded into the music, will be picked up remotely. It will appear to be a hymn. It is not. It's a trigger." A trigger for what? But Holmes was already moving. "We don't stay to speculate. We disable it now." We climbed swiftly back into the chapel, and Holmes bounded up the organ loft steps like a man possessed. I followed close behind, light in hand. Inside the organ casing, beneath the pipes, the mechanism revealed itself, elegant in its concealment. A metal cylinder sat fitted behind the upper keyboard, flanked by small copper wires and a winding gear. Holmes leaned in and cut the wires in 3 swift motions. Then, as if hearing something, he paused. From outside the chapel, a footstep. Holmes turned to me. "Stay hidden." He stepped back from the casing just as the side door creaked open. The listener entered. Alone. He moved down the central aisle, his steps deliberate. This time he did not sit. He went to the base of the organ loft stairs and looked up. "Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "it's nearly time." Holmes descended to meet him. "I think the performance has been cancelled," he said. "There will be no final hymn." The listener tilted his head. "I was told you would understand too late. And yet here I am." The man smiled faintly. "You have interfered, but not ended it. Holloway will adapt. He always does." Holmes studied him carefully. "You're not just a messenger." The listener said nothing. "You're his echo," Holmes said, eyes narrowing. "You speak only when commanded, but you've begun to think. I saw it when you looked at the pew, when you lingered in the shop. You aren't following orders anymore. You're remembering." There was a pause. Then the listener looked down at his hands. "I remember silence," he said, "before the music. I remember being nothing." Holmes took a slow step forward. "You're not nothing, and you don't have to play his final note." The listener looked up. "Then what am I?" "You are the rest," Holmes said gently. "The breath before the sound, the space where meaning lives." For a long moment, neither man moved. Then the listener reached into his coat and removed a folded sheet. He handed it to Holmes. "Give him this," he said. "It's all that remains of what I was. He will understand." Holmes took the page. It was a photograph. Faded, torn, a group of uniformed men, Holloway among them, and behind them, a young man, barely 20, the listener, before the scars, before the silence. Holmes looked back at him, but he was already walking away. He passed Lestrade in the aisle without a word, and vanished into the mist beyond the chapel doors. Holmes stood for a moment, then turned back to the organ. "We stop it here," he said. "But we are not done." He placed the photograph on the lectern. "Holloway plays a long game, but his overture is finished." I looked at the broken wires, the silent keys. "And what now?" I asked. Holmes lifted the cylinder from its cradle and held it up to the light. "We learn the rest of the melody," he said, "and then we find the man who composed it." Back at Baker Street, the morning light filtered through the fog like memory through smoke, thin and reluctant. Holmes stood at the table, sleeves rolled, examining the wax cylinder with the care of a surgeon about to cut into something living. The brass of it gleamed faintly beneath the lamp. I sat nearby, notebook in hand, and Lestrade leaned on the mantelpiece with his arms crossed, watching with the wary gaze of a man who knows something vital has been uncovered but has yet to be explained. Holmes turned the cylinder slowly between his fingers, studying the notches carved along its surface. "This is no ordinary musical recording," he said. "This was created not to be heard, but to be decoded. The vibrations, Watson, minute variations in rhythm and frequency, carry patterns that correspond not to melody, but to information." "An encrypted message?" I asked. Holmes nodded. Holloway repurposed a sacred medium for subversion. The organ was merely a delivery system. The music was the envelope. The cylinder contains the letter Lestrade straightened. "Can it be read?" Holmes gestured to a small machine on the table, his modified phonograph, stripped down and reconstructed to register more than sound. "Watson and I rigged this contraption during the Eintua Bavarian cipher case," he said. "It can interpret changes in pitch too subtle for the ear. We used it then to reveal numeric values hidden in diplomatic music sheets." He placed the cylinder on the drum and wound it. The stylus dropped. A low hum filled the room, not music exactly, not even tone, just a thrumming pulse like a breath held too long. Holmes adjusted the dial, and slowly a ribbon of paper began to feed through the narrow exit slot, emerging in jerky, measured bursts. We watched in silence as the message unspooled. Lines of numbers, symbols, names. Holmes tore the first section free, spread it on the desk, and ran his finger down the length. Then again, slower. He did not look up. Coordinates, he said. Dates, designations. Names of men long presumed dead, or long presumed loyal. Espionage? Lestrade asked. Holmes nodded. But deeper than that. These are not just operatives. These are handlers. Men stationed across Europe. Buried inside offices, consulates, regiments. The kind of names kept from official ledgers. This is Holloway's private index. Lestrade moved beside him. Where did he get this? He built it, Holmes said. Over years, through the chapel, through his network, through men like Chapel and the Listener. Each hymn passed another line. Each funeral was a data drop. I stared at the spooled page. And the final movement? Holmes pointed to the lower edge of the ribbon where 3 names were printed alone. Brackett, Keene, Monk. Beside them, black marks, dots like musical rests, and one name still untouched. Watson. I felt a chill crawl across the back of my neck. Holmes saw the tension in my hand and reached over, pressing the page flat. It was a warning, he said. A final misdirection. You were meant to see it, to fear it. Holloway's last lever. Lestrade looked to the window. Then where is he now? Holmes picked up the photograph, the one given by the Listener. He studied the faces again, then tapped a single detail I'd missed. Behind the men, behind the camp tent, stood a hillside structure, partially hidden. An old observatory, crumbling, the dome cracked, barely visible, and yet unmistakable. Holmes opened the Gazetteer on the table and flipped through pages rapidly. Cumberland, he said. The Keswick Ridge. That building was decommissioned 15 years ago. Lestrade leaned in. You think he's hiding there? No, Holmes replied. I think he recorded this there, and possibly more. We were already gathering our things. The journey north would be long, and the path uncertain. But Holmes was resolute. Something about the image, the symmetry of it, had galvanized him. As we boarded the northbound train, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me since the chapel. Why do all this, Holmes? Why make funerals the conduit? Why use grief as camouflage? He watched the landscape rush by beyond the fogged glass, his voice steady but heavy. Because grief is sacred, he said, and no one listens more intently than in mourning. Holloway exploited the only space left that no one dared question. He turned reverence into a weapon. We arrived in Keswick after dark. The wind howled off the fells and tore through the trees like the voice of something ancient and unsettled. Holmes led us up the winding path by lantern, the old observatory just visible beneath the cloud-soaked moon. The structure was worse than we had imagined, collapsed on one side, rusted iron bones jutting through stone like broken fingers, but the door, surprisingly, opened with a creak. Inside was silence and dust. Holmes moved without hesitation. We passed old telescope mounts, broken crates, rotting ledgers. Then we found it, a second recording device, bigger, cruder, older, and beside it 4 new cylinders. Holmes examined them one by one. They were numbered, not with digits, but with musical notation. Quarter rest, half note, fermata. He placed the first on the drum. The sound it made chilled me to the marrow, not music, not code. A voice, Holloway's. This is not a confession, it said. It is a composition. The state forgot us, buried us, and yet they continued to play their games above ground. So I wrote my own. The second cylinder. You think this is treason, but the empire betrayed itself long ago. I only gave it rhythm. The third. I am not the villain. I am the refrain, the part that returns again and again until it is resolved. And then the fourth. A single phrase. Tell them the music has ended. Then silence. Holmes stood motionless. Lestrade's mouth was drawn in a tight line. I turned to Holmes. "So it's over?" He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "It's only finished playing." Then he picked up the cylinders. "And now we must ensure no one dares replay it." We descended the hill at dawn, boots crunching on frost-glazed stone, the cylinders wrapped tightly in oilcloth and secured in Holmes's satchel like relics from a crypt. The sky above us had taken on that ashen hue peculiar to the Lake District, neither promising sun nor willing to admit defeat. Wind moved low along the slopes, and behind us the observatory sat silent and broken, its shattered dome staring at the sky like the blind eye of something ancient. Holmes walked ahead without speaking, and Lestrade, normally not a quiet man, offered no interruption. I followed them both, the image of Holloway's voice still fresh in my mind, echoing in the quiet spaces between our steps. There had been something irrevocable about it, not merely final, but eternal, like a phrase in music that never resolved, only hovered. Back in Keswick, the telegraph office was shuttered. We made arrangements by rider instead. Holmes sending a sealed parcel addressed to Mycroft, marked in red ink and underlined twice. It contained the cylinders, the photograph, the ciphered printout, and a note of Holmes's own composing, brief, final, and without ambiguity. "The composition is complete. Do not let it be performed again." We caught the early southbound train by a threadbare minute. Holmes said nothing as we settled into the compartment. His fingers tapped lightly on the windowsill, not with impatience, but rhythm. 4 beats, a pause, then 3. I recognized it, the final cadence of the chapel hymn. It had burrowed into us, that music, in ways I did not yet fully understand. After an hour of silence, I said, "Do you believe Holloway is still alive?" Holmes didn't turn from the window. "He's alive in the same way a ghost is. Present, persistent, but unreachable. If he were wise, he left England the moment the service concluded. If not, he waits somewhere, watching to see if his music carried." And if it did, Holmes finally looked at me. "Then someone else will compose the next verse." We arrived in London to find Baker Street already shadowed by evening. The fog, as if sensing the gravity of our return, had gathered again in force, coiling through the trees like breath exhaled by the city itself. Mrs. Hudson had lit the lamps and left a pot of strong Assam on the sideboard, along with 2 slices of currant bread neither of us touched. Lestrade left us at the door, promising to report to Whitehall and make arrangements for the archive beneath St. Hilda's to be sealed and transferred. He wore the same look he had when we last parted after the Milverton affair, a quiet one, tinged with a respect he could not bring himself to voice aloud. Holmes dropped his coat and sat before the fire. I took the opposite chair and waited. After a time he spoke. "You remember the first time I played the violin in your presence, Watson?" I smiled faintly. "I do. You said you found Bach restful because it resolved its own arguments." Holmes gave a dry breath of a laugh. "And yet Holloway chose not to resolve anything. Every measure of his plot was a suspension, every funeral a dissonance waiting to be answered." He leaned forward, fingers steepled. He understood something most men miss, that in chaos people listen more closely. Silence unnerves. Repetition consoles. Grief opens the air. I said nothing. There was nothing to add. After a pause, Holmes said, "Do you recall the listener's question? What am I?" "Yes." Holmes glanced at the hearth. He was a mirror, a man hollowed out and repurposed to reflect Holloway's will, but mirrors distort when cracked. I believe in the end, he saw what Holloway could not. What was that? That purpose becomes cruelty when it denies its own reflection. I leaned forward. "Then you think he chose to stop it?" "I think he did more than that. I think he broke the chain. Every conspiracy lives by rhythm, orders passed, acts executed, silence rewarded. But the listener inserted rest into the phrase. A pause. And that was enough. Holmes rose then and crossed to his desk. From its drawer, he withdrew a final item, one I had not seen him take from the chapel. A page of music, folded once, with a line scrawled at the top in ink that bled slightly on the parchment. This hymn is never to be played again. Holmes unfolded the page and laid it out. The music was simple, almost childlike. No ornament, no elaborate phrasing, just a melody, gentle, steady, unmistakably human. He stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, he reached for his violin. He tuned it carefully. The room fell into a hush as the strings came to life under his fingers. I sat back, the weight of all we had seen pressing in behind my ribs like a held breath. And then he played. Not the coded hymn, not the final movement of Holloway's Requiem, but the antidote, the melody from the page. It filled the sitting room like a balm, like the turning of a key we had forgotten was buried in our chests. The notes rose, not to declare anything but to allow, to acknowledge grief without manipulation, to name silence without breaking it. When the final note faded, Holmes lowered the violin. And for the first time in days, the world seemed quiet. He looked to me, not as the machine of deduction, but as the man I'd first come to know. "It's over, Watson." I nodded. Yes. But we both knew that somewhere, in some archive not yet unearthed, another hand might one day lift the pen. And when it did, we would be listening. The winter rains returned 2 days later, washing the last of the autumn leaves from the pavements and turning the sky into a dull sheet of pewter. London, as ever, moved on. St. Hilda's Chapel was closed under quiet renovation, officially listed as a matter of structural safety. The newspapers, save for a few brief notices about stolen military records and a mysterious death near Limehouse, had already turned their attention elsewhere. Holmes, however, was not idle. He had written only one letter since our return from Keswick. It was addressed not to Mycroft, nor the Yard, nor even the Prime Minister, but to Miss Lena Wess, the woman who had played Holloway's widow with such mournful conviction, and whose silence, we now understood, had been not deception, but loyalty of a darker sort. He received no reply. On the third morning after the chapel incident, I found him in his armchair, pipe in hand, the violin resting beside him. A stack of burned pages lay in the grate. The false hymn, the coded ledgers, and the final list of names from the cylinder. All gone. "You're certain?" I asked, watching the last curl of ash collapse. Holmes exhaled slowly. "Quite. The danger lay not in the players, but in the score. Holloway's list of operatives, real or invented, was a provocation designed to outlive him. Letting it survive would invite pursuit, decryption, war within walls. And the cylinders? Sealed, Holmes replied. Delivered into the hands of Mycroft's most humorless clerk, along with instructions they be archived under classified status, the kind of status even Parliament cannot touch. I nodded. And the listener. Holmes said nothing for a moment, then softly. He vanished beneath the threshold of his own silence. I believe he was born in the shadows Holloway cast, but chose, finally, to walk away from them. That is not defeat, Watson. That is salvation. I reached for my notebook, meaning to capture the final thoughts of the case, when Holmes gestured for me to wait. There is one last element, he said. The only deception I allowed myself. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew something wrapped in dark cloth. Carefully, he unwrapped it. The 5th cylinder. I blinked. There was only 4. There were 4 at the observatory, yes. But this was hidden within the casing of the organ itself, buried behind the pipes. I retrieved it while you and Lestrade examined the chamber below. I wasn't sure then what I held. I sat forward. What's on it? He turned it in his hand. Not code, not music. A confession. He placed it in the phonograph, adjusted the stylus, and wound the crank. The familiar hum filled the room, then resolved into a voice, cracked, deliberate, unmistakably Holloway. This is for you, Mr. Holmes. Holmes didn't move. You've found me, I expect, or you will. You're not the sort who lets questions rot. You must know, this was not revenge. It was memory. The Empire forgets its servants. It buries them beneath ink and silence. I wanted to be heard, just once. And I chose the only medium the state couldn't erase. Music. There was a pause. Breath drawn, the whisper of a man just past exhaustion. I knew you would stop it. That was always the end. But the tune, Holmes, it's been played now, and someone, somewhere, is still listening. The voice faded. The phonograph wound down to silence. Holmes rose and walked to the window. He stood there a long time, the fog clinging to the glass like a second skin. I wonder, he said finally, how many men would give up anonymity not for glory, but simply to be remembered? He turned, the faintest weariness in his voice. Holloway was not a hero, nor a madman. He was what the Empire made him, meticulous, loyal, and discarded. He repaid it with the one thing it fears most. Exposure, I said. Elegy, he corrected. We said little after that. Holmes resumed his experiments the next day, returning to his chemical bench with renewed focus. I left my notes in the drawer beneath the desk, unsure whether I would publish them. Some cases, after all, are not for public consumption. Some end not with a hanging nor a trial, but with a single note, played too softly for the world to hear. And yet, even now, I find myself listening. When I pass by an old chapel or hear a familiar hymn echoing faintly through a foggy street, a pause, just for a moment, to hear if there's something more beneath the melody. A warning, a message, a memory. And I remember Holmes, silhouetted by firelight, holding that final cylinder in his hand, as if it were not evidence, but an echo, an unresolved chord. The last note of a requiem only he could hear. Only he could hear, 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 only he could hear.